They called it scrap metal. Serial 666A, a broken B-17, rotting in the New Guinea sun. But in 1943, one sleepless pilot turned that cursed wreck into a flying gunship and aimed it straight at a fortress guarded by 17 Japanese fighters. This isn't a suicide mission. This is the day a bomber refused to die. In the spring of 1943, the airstrip at Port Moresby wasn't a gateway to glory. It was a waiting room for the dead. The jungle pressed in from all sides, thick and wet, while the tropical sun baked aluminum hulls until they were too hot to touch. The air smelled of burned fuel, rotting vegetation, and exhaustion. At the far end of the runway sat the boneyard, a silent lineup of B-17 bombers torn open by Japanese cannon fire wings, clipped tails, shredded fuselages, punched full of daylight. These weren't heroic machines anymore. They were inventory, spare parts, lessons written in bullet holes. Mechanics stripped them like carcasses to keep the few surviving aircraft in the sky. Every twisted propeller and shattered nose cone told the same logical story. Over Bougainville and the Solomon Sea math ruled the air. Speed beat weight. Agility beat armor. And a damaged bomber didn't get a second chance. But in the middle of that aluminum graveyard sat one aircraft even the scavengers ignored. Serial number 41-2666. The tail ended in 666, enough to make superstitious airmen walk a little faster. But the real curse wasn't the number. It was performance. The aircraft flew heavy in the tail, sluggish on the controls, reluctant to climb. Pilots said it wallowed in the sky like a truck with wings. In combat, hesitation meant death. And this bomber hesitated. So it was parked, forgotten, left to corrode under the New Guinea rain while the war moved north without it. On paper, the verdict was final: too slow, too unstable, too flawed to fight. But wars aren't won on paper. And in that graveyard, one man was about to look at scrap metal and see something entirely different. Serial 41-2666 didn't just sit in the boneyard because of bad luck. It was grounded by reputation, and in wartime aviation, reputation spreads faster than fire. Pilots who had flown her all said the same thing. She was heavy in the tail and slow to answer the controls. In a B-17 balance was everything. If the center of gravity drifted too far aft, the aircraft became unstable in pitch. That meant sluggish climbs, delayed corrections, and a constant fight to keep the nose steady. In combat, where seconds decide survival, hesitation is fatal. This bomber hesitated. Crews described her as wallowing in the air, like a freight train trying to turn into a sports car. She didn't climb eagerly. She didn't respond sharply. When Japanese Zero fighters attacked fast, nimble built for knife fight dogfights, a slow-reacting bomber was a floating target. Logic made the decision easy. The Pacific Theater in 1943 was unforgiving. Aircraft where scarce fuel was precious, and missions were brutal. Commanders didn't gamble on maybe. If a bomber showed consistent handling flaws, you didn't risk 10 men and strategic intelligence on hope. You stripped it for parts and moved on. So mechanics cannibalized better airframes first. Pilots requested anything but 666. Even superstition crept in. The tail number whispered something ominous in a world already soaked in uncertainty. In a sky filled with tracers and cannon fire, Nobody needed extra omens. The verdict became institutional. 41-2666 was junk. Not shot down in glory, not retired with honors, just quietly condemned by performance charts, pilot complaints, and cold arithmetic. In the Pacific, survival was math range, climb rate, turn radius, firepower. And on paper, this bomber failed the equation. But sometimes the most dangerous thing in a war isn't a perfect machine. It's a flawed one in the hands of someone who refuses to accept the math. Every squadron has one, the officer who doesn't quite fit, too old, too intense, too independent. In 1943, that man was Captain J. Zeamer. At 34, he was older than most bomber pilots in the Pacific. The war in the air was a young man's game. Fast reflexes, tight formations, strict discipline. Zeamer respected none of it blindly. He had a reputation for flying too aggressively, for questioning orders, for pushing machines harder than regulations liked. Command called him eager. In military language, that wasn't praise. It meant unpredictable. Worse, he didn't sleep. While other crews collapsed into cots after mission, Zeamer wandered the flight line at night with a flashlight. He studied engines. He examined control surfaces. He read maps like a man searching for an argument. Insomnia in combat can break a pilot. But in Zeamer's case, it sharpened him. He thought when others rested. The squadron didn't quite know what to do with him. He had no permanent crew, no assigned aircraft. Other pilots didn't volunteer to fly under him. He pushed too hard. Command hesitated to give him a bomber. He might bend it, modify it, or break it, chasing perfection. In a system built on standardization, Zeamer was friction. But friction generates heat. And sometimes heat creates something new. Logically, Zeamer understood something others ignored. Control equals survival. In the Pacific, bomber crews were often assigned aircraft with little say. If your plane had quirks, you learned them mid-mission. That meant risk. But if a pilot truly knew his aircraft, every vibration, every imbalance, he could compensate. Zeamer didn't want the best bomber. He wanted his bomber. So when he walked into the boneyard and saw 41-2666 sitting abandoned, he didn't see a cursed airframe. He saw independence. A machine no one else claimed meant no one else controlled it. No competition, no bureaucracy, just potential. On paper, the aircraft was flawed, but so was he. And sometimes in war, the most dangerous combination isn't perfection. It's a pilot with something to prove and nothing left to lose. Most men walk past 41-2666 like it was contagious. J. Zeamer walked toward it. Where others saw scrap, he saw leverage. In a war where aircraft assignments were political currency, an abandoned bomber was freedom. No one would fight him for it. No one would micromanage it. And if he rebuilt it himself, bolt by bolt, he'd understand it better than any factory engineer ever could. That was the logic. A bomber labeled unreliable isn't necessarily doomed, it's misunderstood. Heavy in the tail, then a just load distribution, sluggish climb. Tune the engines, slow response on controls. Learn the lag, anticipate it, fly ahead of the airplane instead of reacting to it. Zeamer didn't argue with the reputation. He attacked it. He started with the basics: spark plugs, clean fuel lines, checked compression, tested. He patched flak holes with scavenged aluminum from dead aircraft nearby. He recalibrated control tensions. Every adjustment wasn't cosmetic, it was tactical. If he could predict how the aircraft would behave under stress, he could weaponize its stability instead of fighting it. Other pilots laughed. They called it a lemon, a hangar queen. They asked if he planned to taxi it into combat since it clearly wouldn't survive the climb. But Ziemer ignored them. He wasn't restoring a museum piece. He was building an argument. A heavy bomber, properly understood, could be stable under fire. Slower reactions meant fewer overcorrections. A solid airframe, even scarred, could absorb punishment. And most importantly, if the plane belonged to him truly, he could modify it. That was the real turning point. This wasn't about proving the experts wrong. It was about removing variables. In combat, uncertainty kills. Ziemer intended to eliminate uncertainty by knowing every vibration, every imbalance, every quirk before the first shot was ever fired. The boneyard didn't look like opportunity to anyone else, but to a pilot who refused to wait for permission, it looked like control. A bomber is only as strong as the men inside it, and Jay Ziemer knew something most squadron commanders wouldn't admit. The best crews weren't always the cleanest on paper. In wartime, discipline was currency, but hunger, the kind that comes from being underestimated, was something else entirely. So Ziemer didn't recruit from the Golden Boys. He went looking for the misfits. Men with reprimands in their files. Men who talked back. Men who were one mistake away from being grounded or shipped home. Not reckless, just restless. Pilots and gunners who hated mediocrity more than they feared danger. At the center of that roster was Joseph Sarnowski, brilliant bombardier, deadly accurate, and chronically insubordinate. He didn't salute sharply enough, didn't sugarcoat his opinions. But when it came to lining up a target at 20,000 feet, few in the Pacific were better. Ziemer saw the pattern talent wrapped in attitude, exactly what he needed. One by one, the crew took shape. A navigator rejected by other teams, gunners labeled difficult men who had been told they didn't quite fit the mold. On paper, they were a disciplinary headache. In reality, they were dangerous. Here's the logic: men who feel disposable often become fearless. If the squadron already thinks you're expendable, the fear of failure loses its grip. And a bomber flying deep into hostile airspace doesn't need polite obedience. It needs aggression, adaptability, and trust built on shared defiance. They became known as the Eager Beavers, half nickname, half warning. Other crews saw them as a liability. Ziemer saw something different, a unit with nothing to prove to the system, only to themselves. Men who wouldn't break under pressure because they'd already been written off. The Air Force didn't assign this team, they assembled themselves. And when a mission came that no one else wanted, it wouldn't be the model crews stepping forward. It would be the ones who had already decided they had nothing to lose. If Port Moresby was the edge of the map, Bougainville was the wall. By mid-1943, American forces were pushing north through the Solomons, leapfrogging islands toward the Philippines. But on every operations map, one shape loomed like a clenched fist: Bougainville. A jagged volcanic mass wrapped in jungle and ringed with airfields. To the Japanese, it was a fortress. To U.S. planners, it was a problem that had to be solved before any further advance. And it wasn't just geography. Bougainville hosted dense anti-aircraft batteries and squadrons of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, fast, agile, and perfectly suited for interception. The island wasn't just defended, It was layered. Radar stations, overlapping flak zones, fighters ready to scramble within minutes. Any invasion without precise intelligence would be guesswork, and guesswork gets Marines killed. Command needed high-resolution mapping photographs, reefs, beach gradients, gun placements, airstrip layouts, not estimates, not outdated charts, exact visuals. The kind you only get by flying directly over the target at altitude holding steady, long enough for cameras to do their work. That's where the math turned ugly. To capture clear images in 1943, a bomber had to fly straight and level for nearly 20 minutes. No weaving, no evasive corkscrews, just a predictable path across hostile sky. In daylight, alone, a formation would draw too much attention. A fighter lacked the range and camera capacity. It had to be a heavy bomber, one bomber, against a base that could launch a swarm. The generals didn't call it suicide. They didn't have to. Any experienced pilot could calculate the odds. A lumbering B-17 versus waves of Zeros climbing to intercept. Even before the first shot, the equation leaned towards 0 survivors. So the missions circulated quietly through the squadrons, and every seasoned crew ran the numbers, speed differential, climb rate, response time, and declined. Because Bougainville wasn't just another target, it was a hornet's nest waiting for something slow enough to sting. When the Bougainville reconnaissance order hit the squadron board, it didn't cause panic, it caused silence. Every experienced pilot understood what the paper didn't say out loud. Fly alone. Maintain straight and level flight for 20 minutes. Daylight. Over the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the Solomons. No escort. No backup within 400 miles. It wasn't bravery that kept men from volunteering. It was arithmetic. A B-17 cruising at mapping speed was predictable. Predictable meant interceptable. Japanese Zero fighters could climb faster, turn tighter, and accelerate harder. Once radar spotted the intruder, a swarm would be airborne within minutes. One bomber against a coordinated pack of interceptors wasn't a dogfight. It was a scheduled execution. Command couldn't order a crew to do it, not directly. The mission required volunteers. Names were not lining up. Pilots who had survived months in the Pacific weren't cowards. They were realists. They'd seen bombers shredded in under 2 minutes. They knew what 20mm cannon shells did to aluminum skin and human bodies. They'd watched friends spiral into the sea because they flew straight just a few seconds too long. Then Jay Zemer heard about it. He didn't see a death sentence. He saw leverage. If he volunteered, command would have to give him clearance to fly. They would have to release the rebuilt 41-2666 from the boneyard. No more waiting for assignment. No more sitting on the sidelines. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated ownership. He looked at Joseph Sarnowski. No long debate, no dramatic speech, just understanding. They both knew the odds. They also knew something else. If someone had to fly into that hornet's nest, it might as well be a crew already written off. Zemer walked into operations and put his name down. The officer behind the desk stared at him, then at the aircraft number he intended to use. Serial 41-2666. There was a pause, the kind that hangs heavy in war. But Zemer didn't hesitate. Either we get the pictures, he said, or we don't come back. The papers were stamped. And just like that, the most dangerous mission in the Pacific had a crew. Jay Zemer knew one thing with absolute clarity. A standard B-17 would not survive Bougainville. The manuals were written for formation, warfare, overlapping fields of fire, mutual protection, strength in numbers. But this mission had none of that. One bomber, alone. If they flew by the book, they would die by the book. So Zimmer threw the book out. The standard B-17 carried around 10 machine guns, defensive weapons, designed to discourage pursuit, not dominate it. But discouragement wouldn't be enough against 17 Zeros diving at 400 miles per hour. He didn't want to scare fighters away. He wanted to break them. The crew went back to the boneyard with wrenches and welding torches. They scavenged .50 caliber machine guns from wrecked airframes. They ripped out standard mounts and replaced them with twin configurations. Waist guns were reinforced. Blind spots in the belly were covered with downward-facing heavy guns. Ammunition belts piled up like coiled snakes across the fuselage floor. 19 machine guns, nearly double regulation. The aircraft grew heavier, yes. But weight wasn't the only variable in combat. Firepower changes behavior. If attacking fighters realize the target can kill them head-on, their tactics fracture. Surprise buys seconds. Seconds buy survival. Then came the most radical modification. The B-17's nose was its weakest point. Japanese pilots knew it. They trained for frontal attacks, charging straight at the cockpit where defensive fire was minimal. Zimmer turned that weakness into a trap. He bolted a fixed-point .50 caliber machine gun directly in front of the pilot's seat, aligned straight through the nose glass. He rigged the trigger to his control yoke. If a Zero came head-on, he wouldn't call for covering fire. He would aim the entire bomber. It was engineering heresy. The recoil could shatter glass. The weight distribution could worsen the balance problem. No factory design supported this configuration. But Zimmer wasn't building a regulation aircraft. He was building a porcupine. Slow, heavy, bristling with quills. If Bougainville was going to swarm them, the swarm would bleed. Dawn at Port Moresby didn't feel heroic. It felt heavy. The rebuilt 41-2666 sat at the edge of the runway like a steel animal loaded for war. 19 machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, full fuel tanks. Mapping cameras bolted into the belly. Every modification Zimmer had forced into the airframe added weight, and weight is the enemy of lift. The other crews watched in silence. No jokes this time. No sarcasm about the hangar queen. They knew where this bomber was headed. They knew the odds. When a single aircraft takes off toward Bougainville alone, it doesn't look like confidence. It looks like a farewell. Zimmer ran through the checklist with clinical focus. Engine temperatures, oil pressure, control response. He didn't rush it. A heavy aircraft demands precision. With the added guns and ammunition, the margin for takeoff error was razor thin. Too slow, and they'd stall into the trees. Too aggressive on the yoke, and the stressed wing spar might protest. He pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared, vibrating through the cockpit floor. The bomber began to roll sluggish at first, as if reluctant to leave the safety of the ground. The jungle at the end of the runway crept closer. Airspeed climbed slowly. Too slowly. For a split second, the math looked unforgiving. Then the wings caught enough air. Zimmer eased back on the yoke. Not a yank, a measured pull. The heavy bomber lifted wheels, clearing the dirt by feet. The aircraft felt like a loaded freight train clawing into humid sky, but it was airborne. Gear up, northbound. Inside the fuselage, the crew checked guns and ammunition feeds one final time. No one spoke much. There's a clarity that comes when a mission has no illusions attached to it. They weren't flying toward a target, They were flying toward an argument with destiny. Ahead lay 400 miles of ocean and the most fortified island in the Pacific. Behind them, the runway was already shrinking into memory. At 25,000 feet, the world looks peaceful. The ocean below stretched endless and blue. Bougainville appeared on the horizon like a green scar in the water. From that altitude, you couldn't see anti-aircraft batteries. You couldn't see fighter revetments. You couldn't see the guns waiting to fire. But they were there. Zimmer leveled the bomber off precisely at mapping altitude. This was the most dangerous phase of the mission, not the approach, not the escape, the hold. To capture usable reconnaissance photographs in 1943, vibration had to be minimal. The cameras mounted in the belly required a stable platform. That meant no banking, no weaving, no evasive corkscrews, just straight and level flight for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes is nothing on the ground. In enemy airspace, it's eternity. The engines droned steadily. The aircraft felt heavy, burdened by fuel, ammunition, and steel. Every correction on the controls came with a slight delay, the same sluggish trait that had once condemned 4-1-2666 to the boneyard. Now Zimmer used it deliberately. A slower response meant fewer accidental overcorrections. He anticipated movement instead of reacting to it. Below, the cameras began clicking. Each shutter snap captured reef patterns, beach gradients, jungle clearings, intelligence gold. Every frame meant fewer American Marines walking blind into machine gun nests. Inside the fuselage, oxygen masks hissed softly. The temperature was below freezing, breath fogged inside goggles. No one spoke unnecessarily. Eyes scanned the horizon, especially toward the sun. Japanese pilots favored high-angle attacks out of glare, a tactic designed to erase warning time. The radio remained silent. Too silent. Everyone understood the logic. Japanese radar stations would already be tracking them. Fighters would be scrambling. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. Then the intercom crackled. Contacts. 6 o'clock. Low. Climbing. The hold was over. The hornet's nest had woken up. They came exactly how the manual said they would. High, fast, out of the sun. 17 Mitsubishi Zeros clawed upward from Bougainville's airfields, forming into attack elements with professional precision. From their perspective, the target looked absurd, a single B-17 flying straight and level like a training drone. No escort, no evasive pattern, just a slow, predictable intruder fat with fuel and cameras. Easy kill. The lead flight rolled over into a classic 12 o'clock high attack. It was textbook Japanese doctrine: dive head-on, fire 20mm cannon into the cockpit, shatter the pilots before defensive gunners could react, then break away clean. The B-17's nose had always been its weakest point. But this wasn't a standard bomber anymore. Zimmer saw the first Zero commit to the dive. He didn't bank away, didn't flinch. Evasion would disrupt the mapping run, and worse, it would hand initiative to the attacker. Instead, he turned slightly toward it. That was the moment the geometry changed. With the fixed point, 5.0 caliber, bolted to the cockpit floor, the entire bomber became a rifle. Zimmer used rudder pressure to fine-tune alignment. He waited. Closing speed was brutal, nearly 500 miles per hour combined. At that velocity, firing too early meant wasted rounds. Too late meant cannon shells through the windshield. The Zero pilot expected fear. What he saw was a heavy muzzle pointed directly at him. Zimmer squeezed the trigger. The cockpit shuddered as the .50 caliber roared. Armor-piercing incendiaries streaked forward in a tight stream, not scattered defensive fire, but aimed deliberate force. The rounds hit center mass, engine block, fuel lines. The Zero disintegrated mid-dive. For a split second, confusion rippled through the Japanese formation. Bombers weren't supposed to punch back from the front. They were supposed to endure. Sarnosky joined in from the flexible nose mount, catching a second fighter as it tried to break off. Smoke trailed behind it. But surprise is brief in war. The remaining Zeros adapted instantly. The formation shattered into a swarm. The easy execution had just turned into a fight. Once the surprise wore off, the sky turned violent. The remaining Zeros didn't panic. They adjusted. The tight formation dissolved into attack waves, circling like wolves testing a wounded animal. They came from the sides, from below, from the rear quarter. Cannon fire stitched across aluminum skin. 20mm shells punched holes the size of fists through wings and fuselage. The interior of 41-2666 erupted in noise steel, tearing ammunition belts, rattling spent brass, piling ankle-deep on the floor. This wasn't a dogfight. It was a siege at 25,000 feet. The added guns proved their worth immediately. Twin-mounted .5s in the waist created overlapping kill zones. Belly guns denied the blind spot Japanese pilots loved to exploit. Every time a Zero committed to a pass, it flew into a corridor of heavy fire. The bomber wasn't agile, but it didn't need to be. It had become a floating crossfire. Then the cost began. A cannon shell exploded near the nose. Shards tore through the glass and into Joseph Sarnosky's abdomen. He collapsed, bleeding heavily. At nearly the same moment, a round smashed through the cockpit floor and shattered Zimmer's knee. Another ripped through his wrist. Blood soaked the rudder pedals. By engineering logic alone, the aircraft should have failed. Hydraulics were hit. Oxygen lines ruptured. Control cables frayed to threads. Structural spars cracked under stress. Every gauge on the panel screamed damage. But the engines still turned. And Sarnosky wasn't finished. Mortally wounded, he dragged himself back to the nose gun. A Zero, assuming the position neutralized, made a slow crossing pass. Sarnosky fired. Tracers walked into the fuel tank. The fighter erupted in flame. The battle stretched past 20 minutes, then 30, then 40. In air combat, engagements are measured in seconds. This one refused to end. 5 confirmed Zeros fell. Others limped away smoking. The Japanese had number, speed, and altitude advantage, but they hadn't expected resistance like this. Inside the battered bomber, the crew wasn't calm. They were furious. And fury backed by 19 guns is a force few interceptors had trained to face. When the Zeros finally broke off, the sky didn't feel victorious. It felt empty. 41-2666 wasn't flying, it was surviving. Smoke trailed from a damaged engine. Hydraulic fluid leaked away into open air. The oxygen system was gone, forcing a descent to breathable altitude. Control cables hung by threads of steel. By structural logic, the aircraft should have torn itself apart under combat stress. But momentum is a powerful thing. Zimmer pushed the nose down into a shallow descent. Not a dive that would overstress the cracked wing spar. Just enough to gain speed and thinner resistance from the swarm that had nearly killed them. His left knee was shattered, his wrist torn open. Every adjustment of the yoke sent white-hot pain up his leg. He wedged his broken limb against the rudder pedal to keep trim flying by feel more than instruments. The radio was dead. The instrument panel half shattered. Blood pooled beneath the pedals. 400 miles. That was the distance back to Port Moresby. In a healthy bomber, it was routine. In this condition, it was a gamble against gravity and structural fatigue. The co-pilot offered to take over. Ziemer refused. He knew every quirk of this aircraft, every delayed response, every vibration in the controls. A heavy-handed correction could snap the frayed cables and end them all. Inside the nose, Joseph Sarnowski lay dying, barely conscious. The engines droned unevenly as they crossed back over open water. Time blurred. Ziemer drifted toward blackout more than once, snapping awake as the aircraft dipped. He didn't think about metals. He thought about balanced throttle pressure and keeping wings level. Ahead, the mountains of New Guinea rose like a final test. To clear them, he had to climb. And climbing was the one thing this bomber had never liked to do. Clearing the Owen Stanley Mountains was only half the battle. Now Ziemer had to land a dying aircraft. Port Moresby appeared ahead, a strip of brown carved into jungle. Beautiful, final. But beauty doesn't slow a 30-ton bomber with no hydraulics. The damage report in his head was brutal. No functioning flaps, no brakes, frayed control cables, cracked wing spar. Landing speed would be higher than normal. Too fast and they'd overrun into the trees. Too slow and a stall would snap the wings clean off. The radio was dead. No tower guidance, no clearance. Ziemer fired a red flare. Out of the cockpit window, the universal signal of distress. On the ground, crews scattered. Fire trucks rolled. Ambulances took position. They could see the damage even from a distance, the shredded tail, the torn nose, smoke trailing behind. Final approach. Without flaps, the bomber refused to bleed speed easily. Ziemer cut power, carefully easing the nose down. Every correction had to be gentle. A sharp input could shear the weakened spar. His shattered leg throbbed against the rudder pedal as he fought crosswind drift with what strength remained. The runway rushed up. He flared late, deliberately minimizing stress on the cracked structure. The main wheels hit hard. The aircraft bounced once, then settled into a violent roll. No brakes, just friction and distance. The bomber thundered down the strip, chewing through runway until dirt replaced pavement. Dust swallowed the cockpit. The jungle loomed ahead. Finally, momentum surrendered. The aircraft ground to a stop just short of the trees. The engines coughed, then died. Silence flooded the cockpit. Jay Ziemer slumped forward over the controls. The mission was complete. Now survival belonged to the medics. When the dust settled on the edge of that runway, mechanics approached the bomber like men walking up to a ghost. They had patched bullet holes before. They had replaced engines, tails, even wings. But this was different. The aircraft looked less like a machine and more like something that had clawed its way out of a furnace. The final count stunned everyone: 187 bullet holes and 5 20mm cannon strikes. The rudder was nearly gone. The wing spar was cracked. Control cables were hanging by threads. By engineering standards, it should never have made it home. Joseph Sarnowski died shortly after landing, having held his position long enough to finish the fight. Jay Ziemer hovered between life and death for days, surgeons unsure if he would survive or ever walk again. But while doctors fought for him, intelligence officers developed the film. The photographs were crystal clear. Every reef line, every gun position, every airstrip layout on Bougainville mapped in unforgiving detail. Those images became the blueprint for invasion planning. Marines would later land with knowledge instead of guesswork. Lives were saved not by luck, but by a crew that refused to abort. Ziemer and Sarnowski were awarded the Medal of Honor. The rest of the crew received decorations as well. The Hangar Queen was beyond repair and returned to the boneyard not as scrap, but as legend. Because in the end, the numbers were wrong. On paper, a damaged bomber against 17 fighters equals destruction. But paper doesn't calculate defiance. It doesn't measure stubbornness, loyalty, or the will to hold a straight line when every instinct screams to turn away. Serial 41-26666 was supposed to be junk. Instead, it became proof of a simple truth. Machines don't decide battles. People do.